Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. May 4th, 1945. Kufstein, Austria. Imagine yourself perched atop the turret of an M4A3 Sherman tank, engine rumbling softly beneath you, the Austrian countryside unfurling before your eyes like a wrinkled painted map. This was the vantage point of 27-year-old First Lieutenant John Carey Lee, Jr., a tank commander from Norwich, New York, who had spent the last 5 months navigating his men through the brutal, unforgiving landscapes of France and Germany, each battle leaving its mark and earning him a hard-won Bronze Star. His Sherman, affectionately dubbed Besotten Jenny by one of his African-American crew members after a wayward girlfriend back home, had become more than a machine. It was a second home, a loyal companion in a war that had swallowed so many. But on that seemingly ordinary spring morning, destiny was about to rewrite the rules of war. Within hours, Lee would not only command his American soldiers, but also German Wehrmacht troops and French political prisoners, uniting in an extraordinary stand against the very forces he had been fighting for years. The arithmetic of battle was about to be overturned in a way no one could have imagined. The Battle of Castle Itter would emerge as the sole engagement in World War II, where American and German soldiers fought side by side, united in defense of French prisoners against a fanatical SS onslaught. This was no tale of propaganda or fanciful storytelling. This was the last battle of the war in Europe, a moment etched indelibly into the memory of all who witnessed it, high on a hill overlooking the majestic Austrian Alps. The improbable seeds of this alliance had been sown 3 years earlier, in 1943. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust and commander of the SS, had resolved to convert a medieval castle into a prison for France's most valuable hostages. Castle Itter, locally known as Schloss Itter, jutted dramatically from a 666-meter knoll at the entrance to the Brixenthal Valley, roughly 5 kilometers south of the town of Virgil and 20 kilometers west of Kitzbühel. Though the fortress had officially stood since 1241, historians suspected the site had been occupied as early as the 10th century. The castle was rebuilt in 1532, extensively renovated in 1878, and by the early 20th century had been transformed into a hotel. Everything changed in 1938 with Germany's annexation of Austria during the Anschluss. By late 1940, the German authorities officially leased Castle Itter from its owner, Franz Gruner. For 2 years, the building remained largely untouched until February 7, 1943, when SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, acting on direct orders from Himmler, seized it outright. Pohl, head of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office and chief administrator of the concentration camps, was a central architect of the Holocaust. By April 25, 1943, the transformation into a prison facility was complete, with the castle placed under the administrative oversight of the Dachau concentration camp, some 90 miles to the northwest. Would you, standing on that turret alongside Lee, have imagined that the next hours would place you in the midst of a battle no history book could have predicted? The stage was set, and the most extraordinary chapter of World War II was about to unfold. The prisoners who would eventually call Castle Itter home were no ordinary captives. They were a veritable gallery of France's political and military elite, each one a high-value asset in the Reich's eyes. whether as bargaining chips or sources of intelligence. Picture Edouard Daladier, 60 years old, the former French Prime Minister who had signed the infamous Munich Agreement in 1938 in a desperate bid to appease Hitler. Daladier had understood even then the true nature of Hitler's ambitions, warning the British in April 1938 that the Führer's ultimate aim was domination of the continent. After France fell, he was arrested by the Vichy government, tried for treason in the Riom trial, imprisoned at Fort de Portelet, and ultimately handed over to the Germans in 1943. Months in Buchenwald had not broken him. In May 1943, he arrived at Ytter, entering a new chapter of captivity. In another cell sat his longtime political rival and successor, 66-year-old Paul Renault, who had become premier in March 1940. Renault had fiercely opposed surrender to Germany, striving desperately to save France from occupation. Yet on June 16, 1940, he resigned and was later captured while trying to escape. He endured stints in Sachsenhausen and Fort de Portelet before arriving at Castle Ytter. The bitter rivalry between Daladier and Renaud, rooted in the political skirmishes of the 1930s, persisted unabated, coloring their interactions even behind prison walls. The castle also held two former supreme commanders of the French armed forces. Maurice Gamelin, 72, had struggled and failed to repel the German advance in the spring of 1940, carrying resentment over his replacement. Maxime Weygand, 78, who succeeded Gamelin as supreme commander in May 1940, had initially collaborated with the Germans following France's surrender before being imprisoned in 1942. The mutual disdain between these generals ensured a constant undercurrent of tension within the fortress. Among the other notable captives was tennis champion Jean Baratra, 46, the famed bounding Basque of Biarritz, who had won Wimbledon twice in his 20s. Baratra was imprisoned for resigning as Vichy France's Commissioner for Sport and Physical Education in April 1942, and later being caught attempting to escape to join Allied forces. Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, elder sister of Free French leader Charles de Gaulle and a member of the Resistance, arrived in April 1945, just weeks before the war's end. The roster also included François de la Roque, the right-wing leader with a bitter disdain for labor organizer Léon Jouot, Michel Clemenceau, 71, son of the World War I era premier, and several others whose ideological differences were rivaled only by their determination to sustain old enmities, even in captivity. In the castle's small dining room, they ate at separate tables, their heated debates providing perverse amusement for their German captors. Yet, despite the animosities, life at Ytter was far more bearable than virtually any other German prison. The French prisoners slept in converted hotel rooms, had unrestricted access to the castle's vast library, and could exercise daily in a courtyard surrounding a 13th century fountain. Daladier even maintained a secret radio, smuggled in by sympathetic guards, through which he clandestinely listened to BBC broadcasts. The facility's staff was minimal, a handful of SS guards from the Totenkopfverbände and a team of Eastern European prisoners from Dachau, responsible for maintenance. Among these workers was Zvonimir Kukovic, a Croatian electrician and member of the Yugoslav communist resistance, who quietly helped keep the castle running. The prison commandant, Captain Sebastian Wimmer, administered the castle with a mix of strict military discipline and occasional gestures of civility. But by late April 1945, as Allied forces closed in from every direction and Hitler's so-called Thousand-Year Reich crumbled into chaos, the atmosphere within Castle Itter grew increasingly fraught. The prisoners shared a growing fear that, as the war ended, the SS might begin executing them to erase witnesses to their crimes. Their fear was well-founded across Germany and occupied Europe. SS units were systematically murdering prisoners in the final days before liberation. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces encircled the Reich Chancellery. The war in Europe was effectively over, yet pockets of fanaticism refused to surrender. On May 2nd, Edward Weiter, the former commandant of Dachau, fled to Castle Itter as American troops liberated his former camp, only to die that same day under mysterious circumstances. His sudden demise terrified Captain Wimmer, who feared he might be next. By May 4th, with artillery thundering in the distance and Allied troops clearly approaching, Wimmer made a fateful decision. He abandoned his post, fleeing with the majority of his guards. The SS Totenkopfverbände troops, following their commander's lead, vanished into the surrounding countryside. In an instant, 14 French VIP prisoners found themselves in command of a medieval fortress, armed only with the few small arms left behind by the departing guards. Technically, they were free, but freedom in that precarious castle atop the Austrian Alps was a fragile illusion. The hills surrounding Castle Itter were crawling with Waffen-SS troops, fanatically loyal even after Hitler's death. Oberfuhrer Georg Bachmann's units had taken up positions nearby, ordered to descend on the fortress and execute every remaining prisoner. Any attempt by the French to flee on foot would almost certainly have ended in immediate death. Their only hope lay in reaching the approaching Allied forces before Bachmann's men could strike. Daladier and Renaud, their decades-long political rivalry temporarily set aside in the face of mortal danger, convened to decide on a desperate course of action. They needed someone capable of slipping past SS patrols and reaching American lines. The choice fell on Zvonimir Chuchkovich, the Croatian handyman who had quietly worked at the fortress throughout their captivity. On May 3rd, under the guise of running an errand, Chuchkovich set out. The town of Virgil lay 8 kilometers down the mountain, but it was occupied by German troops. Undeterred, he pressed on, following the Inn River Valley toward Innsbruck. Some 64 kilometers away, the journey was perilous. Waffen-SS patrols scoured the roads, shooting anyone suspected of desertion or treachery. Civilians displaying white flags from windows were fired upon, and all military-age men faced instant execution. Chuchkovich moved with painstaking caution, avoiding main roads when possible, using his knowledge of the terrain and his ability to pass as a local worker. By late evening on May 3rd, exhausted and battered from the trek, he reached the outskirts of Innsbruck and encountered an advance party of the 409th Infantry Regiment of the American 103rd Infantry Division, part of the U.S. 6th Corps. Without hesitation, he briefed the American officers on the fortress and its high-profile French prisoners. Recognizing the strategic and political urgency, the Americans quickly acted. At dawn on May 4th, Major John T. Kramers organized a heavily armored rescue mission. Tanks, half-tracks, and infantry of the 103rd Division rolled toward Castle Itter. Progress was steady at first, but just past the town of Genbach, roughly halfway to the fortress, German artillery opened fire. Heavy shells rained down, forcing the column to halt. Kramers faced a critical decision, but it was taken out of his hands. Superior officers recalled the column, citing concerns over entering territory assigned to the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. Military bureaucracy and territorial lines triumphed over urgency. Only 2 jeeps with auxiliary personnel were allowed to continue, but without armored support or infantry, they stood little chance against the SS if engaged. Back at the castle, the prisoners waited anxiously, unaware that Chuchkovich's mission, while partially successful, had failed to secure immediate rescue. Hours stretched into an entire day without news, intensifying their fear. They had armed themselves with rifles, submachine guns, and pistols left behind by the fleeing guards. But 14 elderly politicians and a tennis champion were hardly a match for seasoned Waffen-SS troops. A new plan was required. Among the remaining Eastern European workers was Andreas Krobot, a Czech cook who had served meals to both prisoners and guards throughout the war. Courageously, he volunteered to ride a bicycle to Virgil despite the danger. The prisoners handed him a letter detailing their peril and pleading for urgent assistance. At midday on May 4th, Krobot mounted his bicycle and began the 8-kilometer descent down the mountain, carrying both the letter and their desperate hopes. The journey, which under normal circumstances would take less than an hour, became a gauntlet. Retreating Wehrmacht soldiers, advancing Allied patrols, and roaming SS execution squads made every kilometer a test of life and death. As Krobot neared Virgil, he found the town recently vacated by Wehrmacht forces, only to be reoccupied by roaming Waffen-SS units. Civilians had hung white sheets and Austrian flags from windows, signaling surrender to the Americans. But Himmler's orders were explicit. Any town attempting surrender was guilty of treason, and all military-age males were to be shot on sight. SS snipers scanned the streets, and execution squads prowled relentlessly. Krobot's approach nearly ended in disaster. An SS patrol spotted him, and he was seconds from capture, questioning, and likely execution when a door swung open and someone yanked him inside. His savior was Major Josef Sepp Gangl, a career Wehrmacht officer who had joined the Reichswehr on November 1st, 1928, 7 years before it became the Wehrmacht. Gangl had commanded a battery with 105 mm howitzers at the Battle of Kiev in 1941, with Army Group South on the Eastern Front. He had fought at the defense of Caen and Normandy in June 1944 and in the Battle of the Bulge near Bastogne in December 1944. Here was a man forged in the furnace of Europe's deadliest battles, about to become an unlikely guardian in the chaos surrounding Castle Itter. The precise moment of his moral transformation is lost to history. But by May 1945, Major Josef Sepp Gangl had made a choice that, if discovered by the SS, would have cost him his life. He had defied orders to retreat, instead allying himself with the Austrian resistance under local leader Rupert Hagleitner. Gangl commanded the remnants of a Wehrmacht artillery unit, about 10 to 20 soldiers' men who, like him, had become disillusioned with the Nazi cause. They had chosen the perilous path of treason rather than continue serving a regime they had come to despise. When Andreas Krobot explained the desperate situation at Castle Itter, Gangl immediately grasped the stakes. 14 high-profile French prisoners, including 2 former premiers and Charles de Gaulle's sister, trapped 8 kilometers away, facing imminent execution by the SS. Gangl understood the moral imperative and the opportunity. Helping them could partially redeem years of service to a criminal regime, proving that not all German soldiers were monsters. Yet he also recognized a stark reality. His small force was woefully inadequate to defend the fortress against the 100 or more SS troops reported in the area. Reinforcements were essential, and there was only one place to find them. Taking an enormous personal risk, Gangl hoisted a white flag, climbed into his Kubelwagen command car with Krobot beside him, and drove north toward the booming sound of American artillery. He was literally driving toward the enemy he had spent years fighting, hoping they wouldn't fire on sight. 8 kilometers north, in the Austrian border town of Kufstein, a reconnaissance unit of 4 M4A3 Sherman tanks from the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, U.S. 21st Corps, sat in the town square, awaiting relief from the 36th Infantry Division. Their commander, First Lieutenant John Carey Lee, Jr., was a stocky, cigar-chewing, whiskey-drinking 27-year-old from Norwich, New York. Known affectionately as Captain Jack to his crew, Lee had earned a Bronze Star after 5 months of relentless combat leading Company B across France and Germany. His crew included Sergeant William Rushford, Corporal Edward J. Shimchick, a quiet yet deadly accurate gunner, Corporal Edward J. Siner, and Private First Class Herbert G. McHaley. Their bond had been forged in the furnace of continuous combat, built on trust, respect, and survival. When Gangl's Kubelwagen rolled into Kufstein on the afternoon of May 4th, flying the enormous white flag, American sentries nearly opened fire, but recognition of the surrender signal saved him. Gangl stepped out slowly, hands raised, still adorned in his Wehrmacht uniform and decorations. He was escorted immediately to Lee's forward position. Through a mix of broken English and gestures, Gangl conveyed the situation. 14 French VIP prisoners trapped in a fortress 8 kilometers away, a fanatical Waffen-SS force preparing to attack, a small Wehrmacht contingent willing to fight against them, and the desperate need for American assistance. Most officers, exhausted after months of combat with peace looming, might have balked at risking men on a mission far outside operational boundaries, involving collaboration with enemy soldiers. John Lee was not most officers. Without hesitation, he volunteered to lead the rescue. He radioed his battalion headquarters, explained the situation, and requested authorization. Recognizing both the political significance of the prisoners and Lee's determination, his superiors approved the operation. Lee began assembling his relief force immediately. His initial plan called for Besotten Jenny, his Sherman, along with Lieutenant Wallace S. Holbrook's Bosch Buster, and 6 soldiers from the All-African American Company D, 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, riding atop the tanks as additional firepower. At the last moment, recognizing the need for more armor, Lee requisitioned 5 more Shermans and supporting infantry from the recently arrived 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division. The column that rolled out of Kufstein on the afternoon of May 4th was extraordinary. Lee's Sherman led the way, its 70mm gun scanning for threats. Behind it, Holbrook's Bosch Buster and 5 additional Shermans followed. 6 African-American soldiers clung to the tank holes, rifles at the ready. Major Gangl rode in his Kubelwagen alongside Lee's lead tank, with Krobot guiding them through treacherous terrain. Bringing up the rear was a truck carrying Gangl's 10 Wehrmacht soldiers, still in their German uniforms, armed and ready. This mixed American-German column was unprecedented in modern warfare. Sworn enemies who had spent years attempting to annihilate one another, now moving together toward a shared objective, bound not by nationality, but by a common belief that some things, honor, duty, and humanity, transcend politics and ideology. Yet the journey was perilous, every mile fraught with the possibility of deadly encounter. As the column neared the first river crossing, Lee faced a critical challenge. The bridge could barely support his lighter Shermans, and the weight of the entire column might cause it to collapse. A misstep here could destroy tanks and leave his force stranded and vulnerable to enemy attack. After a tense assessment, Lee made a difficult, pragmatic choice. He sent the 5 requisitioned Shermans from the 142nd Regiment back, reducing his relief force to just 2 tanks, 6 African-American infantrymen, and Major Gangel's Wehrmacht soldiers. It was a slim force, but Lee calculated that 2 Shermans, with their 17 Ams guns and 50 caliber machine guns, could hold off any immediate assault long enough for reinforcements to arrive. As they approached Virgil, scattered resistance tested their resolve. An SS machine gun nest had been hastily set up to cover the road. Lee's lead Sherman, Besotten Jenny, unleashed its main gun and 50 caliber machine gun, cutting the position to pieces and sending the survivors fleeing into the surrounding woods. The column rumbled cautiously through Virgil, where Austrian civilians peeked from windows, waving cautiously. The town remained dangerous. Snipers lingered in some buildings, and SS loyalists hid in attics and cellars, ready to strike. Major Gangel directed Lee to leave 1 tank and some infantry behind to support the Austrian resistance fighters. Lee agreed, detaching Bosch Buster and Lieutenant Holbrook's crew to hold the town. The remaining relief force Besotten Jenny, 6 African-American soldiers, and Gangel's Wehrmacht troops was pitifully small for the task ahead, defending a fortress against 100 or more SS combatants. But time would not wait for reinforcements. Early in the evening of May 4th, as the column approached the village of Ida, another peril presented itself. Retreating German forces had wired a bridge on the approach with explosives. The detonator was hidden among the brush, wires snaking along the road. Major Gangel, displaying steady nerves and remarkable courage, dismounted with several of his soldiers and painstakingly disconnected the detonator, cutting the wires and rendering the explosives harmless. The incident reminded all that danger lurked in every shadow, and the margin for error was razor thin. Finally, as they neared the fortress itself, an almost surreal scene unfolded. 2 French prisoners, armed with rifles left behind by the fleeing guards, challenged the approaching vehicles. When they recognized the American tank and saw Andreas Krobot waving from Gangel's Kubelwagen, word spread like wildfire through the castle. The realization ignited elation. The Americans had arrived. They were saved. When First Lieutenant Lee climbed down from Besotten Jenny's turret and entered the courtyard, he was greeted by a scene that, under any other circumstance, might have seemed comical. 14 elderly French prisoners surged forward, speaking rapid-fire French, offering thanks, handshakes, and embraces. Former premiers Daladier and Renault, political rivals who had barely spoken in months, both rushed to shake Lee's hand. Tennis champion John Baratra greeted him with vigorous enthusiasm, while Marie-Agnès de Gaulle maintained her characteristic formal composure as she expressed gratitude. Yet joy was tempered by a sobering realization. The relief force was far smaller than the prisoners had imagined. They had expected a battalion, perhaps even a full company. Instead, they received a single Sherman tank, fewer than a dozen American soldiers, and a handful of Wehrmacht troops. Now came an awkward, delicate moment. Major Gangel, the German officer who had risked his life to come to their aid, was introduced to the French captives. Some, particularly the military men like Generals Gamelin and Wehrmacht, regarded him with suspicion, barely masking hostility. Others, recognizing the bravery and moral courage it took to turn against his own army, offered cautious respect. Among the prisoners, another unexpected defender, whose identity would soon prove invaluable, was also introduced, completing the unusual and fragile alliance that would stand against the SS. Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader, an SS Hauptsturmführer, had been recovering in a nearby village after a combat wound when he struck an unlikely friendship with some of the French prisoners. When the guards fled and the prisoners realized they were alone and in mortal danger, they asked Schrader to take charge of their defense. Like Major Gangel, Schrader had grown disillusioned with the Nazi regime. He chose to protect the prisoners rather than abandon them, moving his own family into the fortress for safety, fully aware that discovery by his former SS comrades would mean execution. The surrealism of the situation was now complete. An SS officer fighting alongside Wehrmacht soldiers and Americans against other SS troops. First Lieutenant John Carey Lee Jr. now commanded what may have been the strangest military force assembled during World War II. His own American tank crew, 6 African-American infantrymen, 10 to 20 Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangel, 1 SS officer who had rejected his oath to Hitler, and 14 French prisoners, armed with whatever weapons the fleeing guards had left behind. Black Americans, white Americans, German soldiers, a former SS officer, and French politicians of widely varying political persuasions, all preparing to stand together against fanatical Waffen-SS troops. Lee immediately assumed command of the fortress defense, applying professional military judgment to a scenario that defied every lesson from Norwich University. He conducted a rapid reconnaissance of the castle's defensive potential and found it surprisingly favorable. The structure occupied commanding high ground, overseeing all approaches. Its thick stone walls, while medieval in design, would stop small arms fire and offer partial protection against artillery fragments. The layout included several fallback positions, allowing defenders to retreat deeper if the outer walls were breached. Lee identified the inner keep as a final stronghold, a last line of defense if necessary. The main entrance, a large wooden gate framed by a stone archway, naturally funneled attackers into a narrow approach. Lee positioned Besatten-Jenny directly in front, her 76-meter gun covering the road. The Sherman would serve as a mobile pillbox and steel barrier, preventing the SS from simply driving through the gate. American infantry and Gangel's Wehrmacht troops were stationed around the perimeter, with overlapping fields of fire on every approach. Despite Lee's orders to remain inside, the French prisoners insisted on joining the defense. Generals Gamelin and Wehrmacht, both in their 70s, took positions with rifles. Tennis champion Barotra grabbed a submachine gun. Even 71-year-old Michel Clemenceau took a rifle and found a firing position overlooking the main approach. Ammunition left by the fleeing guards was adequate for a few hours, but there was no hope of resupply if the battle dragged on. As darkness fell on May 4th, Lee enforced strict light discipline. The SS lurked in the night, and he would not make their position easier to attack. Major Gangel shared intelligence. Waffen-SS troops under Oberführer Georg Bochmann had occupied hills and woods surrounding the fortress for days. These were not rear echelon soldiers. They were battle-hardened veterans who had fought on multiple fronts, still fanatically loyal despite Hitler's death. Gangl estimated their numbers at 100 to 150 men, possibly more, equipped with small arms, machine guns, mortars, and at least one 8mm anti-tank gun. Against them, the defenders numbered fewer than 40, including the French prisoners. The odds were grim. Throughout the night of May 4th to 5th, SS reconnaissance patrols probed the fortress defenses, firing sporadically to test weaknesses. The defenders returned fire, responding to every shadow, every movement in the darkness. The SS refrained from a full-scale assault until daylight, when they could better coordinate their superior numbers. Inside the fortress, the unlikely coalition tried to rest in shifts while maintaining watch. American soldiers shared cigarettes and coffee with Wehrmacht troops they had recently been fighting. The French prisoners spoke quietly among themselves, their political differences momentarily forgotten in the face of shared danger. At dawn on May 5th, the defenders glimpsed the reality outside. Waffen-SS forces had taken up positions in the surrounding woods, moving under the cover of night into assault positions. Morning mist rising from the valley floor provided additional concealment as the SS finalized their preparations. Around 7 o'clock, the attack began. The crack of Mauser rifles and the rattle of MG-42 machine guns shattered the morning calm. Bullets pinged off stone walls and whistled above the defenders' heads. Lee's tank crew responded immediately, traversing Besatten Jenny's turret toward flashes in the woods and opening up with the .50 caliber machine gun. The assault escalated around 8 o'clock as 100 to 150 Waffen-SS soldiers advanced on the fortress, moving with professional discipline. They employed fire and maneuver tactics, one group providing covering fire while another advanced. The defenders poured rifle and machine gun fire into the attackers, forcing them to take cover and slowing their progress. Besatten Jenny's 76mm gun thundered repeatedly, high explosive shells detonating among SS positions, throwing earth and shrapnel in every direction, a steel heartbeat of defiance amid the chaos. Can you hear it? The staccato rattle of machine gun fire carving the morning air? The Sherman's guns never stopped barking, their bursts forcing the attackers' heads low and turning open ground into a deadly no-go zone. Along the stone ramparts, a most improbable tableau unfolded. American tankmen, German Wehrmacht soldiers, and French prisoners shoulder to shoulder, trading fire with the Waffen-SS as if politics had been stripped away and only survival remained. Corporal Edward J. Shimchick, Lee's gunner, picked his targets with the methodical calm of a marksman who had earned his reputation the hard way. After every pull of the trigger, he adjusted, measured, and fired again. Exactness that kept Company B alive. The 6 African-American soldiers from the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, veterans hardened by months of fighting across Europe, shot with the concentrated economy of men who knew every round mattered. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl moved like a conductor among them, pacing the perimeter, issuing orders, aligning fields of fire, his military instinct anticipating enemy moves and fitting his small force into the castle's bones. Old soldiers proved as steady as the young. Maurice Gamelin, who had commanded French forces at the war's outset, handled his rifle with the ease of a lifetime's practice. Jean Barotrat, the once fleet-footed tennis champion, flitted from post to post with an athlete's grace, hauling ammunition, bandaging wounded defenders, dragging men to cover. The SS, meanwhile, attacked with a terrifying religious fervor. Small stormtrooper groups repeatedly tried to surge the gate, only to be hammered back by besotten Jenny's machine guns and the concentrated rifle fire from the walls. Mortars began to fall in the courtyard, each blast hurling dust and fear, breaking up defensive patterns and forcing defenders to cling to whatever shelter they could find. Late morning brought a sliver of hope. Major Gangel managed to contact the Austrian resistance in Virgil by telephone and begged for reinforcements. The answer was bleak but brave. Only 3 fighters could be spared: 2 Germans who had joined Gangel's band and a teenage Austrian partisan. Those 3 raced toward the castle through roads still hunted by SS execution squads. And, against awful odds, they arrived to take their place among the defenders just as the situation tightened. By noon, ammunition was a fracturing worry. Lee ordered fire discipline. Engage only clearly seen targets. Make every cartridge count. Besotten, Jenny's stores were waning, high explosive rounds running particularly low. Then, as if to underscore the defenders' growing peril, the SS brought up their most dreaded armament, an 80-millimeter gun. The valley answered with the distinctive crack of its high-velocity rounds, and one such shell struck home, a round that punched through the Sherman's armor and shattered its fighting capability. With the tank dead, Lee ordered the crew out. They withdrew to the walls, leaving the courtyard without the Sherman's suppressive weight. The attackers pressed in, sensing the advantage. Around 1300 hours, with ammunition nearly gone and the SS preparing what looked like a final gate-shattering push, fate moved cruelly and swiftly. Major Gangel saw former Premier Paul Reynaud exposed to sniper fire near a window. The 66-year-old stood apparently unaware of the danger. Without thought for his own safety, Gangel crossed the courtyard to pull Reynaud back. As he reached him, a Mauser round, a 7.92 .557 Mittelhaus bullet from an SS sniper, struck Gangel in the head. He fell instantly, collapsing at Reynaud's feet. The impact of Gangel's death stunned the defenders for a heartbeat. Then that shock turned to a furious, concentrated return of fire. American gunners, Wehrmacht soldiers, and the French captives all poured lead toward the sniper positions. Lee reacted with decisive tactical sense. He ordered a fighting withdrawal from the outer walls, consolidating his force toward the inner keep to prepare for a last stand. The move shortened lines, tightened defensive arcs, and made every defender's fire more mutually supporting. But the SS were not finished. A squad worked to bring a Panzerfaust into position to blast the main gate. If they succeeded, the courtyard would be open and the last hope for the defenders would be extinguished. At that tense moment, Jean Borotra stepped forward with a plan that bordered on the heroic and the desperate. He proposed to vault the wall, sprint through SS lines, and reach the American reinforcements Lee had radioed for hours earlier, a mission that, by any measure, was almost certainly suicidal. What sane choice did he have? If no one ran, the castle would fall and everyone inside would die. Borotra, still possessing the speed and coordination of a world-class athlete, even at 46, understood the calculus. He knew that the difference between action and inaction was the difference between life and extermination for everyone there. Lee, recognizing the audacity and necessity of Borotra's plan, gave his reluctant but resolute approval. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jean Borotra, the legendary bounding Basque, lived up to his nickname one last time. He vaulted to the top of the fortress wall, paused for a heartbeat, then dropped to the ground outside. Absorbing the fall with the rolling technique honed over decades of athletic competition, Baratra sprang to his feet and sprinted. SS soldiers spotted him immediately, their bullets kicking up dirt and whizzing past his head. But Baratra, moving with a blend of speed, agility, and sheer determination, dodged and weaved through the hail of fire, disappearing into the woods. For long minutes, the defenders inside could only wait, hearts pounding, unsure whether he would make it. Inside the fortress, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Ammunition was almost exhausted. SS troops were massing for a final assault, and the Panzerfaust team was moving into position to breach the main gate. Lee gathered his remaining men, Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers alike, into the keep, preparing for close-quarters combat with bayonets, rifle butts, and sheer resolve should the ammunition fail. The French prisoners, defying orders to remain hidden, stood with their rifles alongside trained soldiers. Daladier and Renaud, former political rivals, fought shoulder to shoulder, their enmity momentarily forgotten. General Wehrmacht, who had once collaborated with the Germans, now readied himself to die opposing them. It was a scene that defied imagination just days before. Then around 4 o'clock, a new sound split the tension. Not the crack of German rifles, but the deep boom of American tank cannons, accompanied by the unmistakable rattle of 50 caliber machine guns. The SS troops advancing on the gate suddenly found themselves caught in a crossfire from behind. The American relief column, guided through enemy territory by Baratra, who had miraculously survived his desperate run, arrived at the critical moment. Multiple Sherman tanks and a company of infantry poured into the valley, overwhelming the SS attackers. Caught between the defenders in the fortress and the newly arrived Americans, Bochmann's men broke. Some were cut down as they fled, others surrendered. Approximately 100 SS troops were taken prisoner, while the remainder scattered into the Austrian countryside, evading capture for weeks. The Battle of Castle Itter, perhaps the strangest engagement of World War II, was over. From the first shots at dawn to the relief column's arrival in the late afternoon, about 40 defenders, including 14 elderly French prisoners, had held off between 100 and 150 Waffen-SS troops, inflicted significant casualties, and preserved the lives of 14 individuals destined to shape post-war France. The cost of this improbable victory was remarkably light. 4 defenders were wounded, none critically. Only one life was lost. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, felled by an SS sniper while shielding Paul Renaud. Gangl had survived years of brutal combat across Europe, only to embrace a new cause in the war's final days, ultimately giving his life for a mission of courage and conscience. That same evening, the French prisoners were evacuated under American escort, traveling through Austria and Germany to Paris, where they arrived on May 10, 1945. For his extraordinary heroism, First Lieutenant John C. Lee, Jr. was promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation praised his intrepid actions, personal bravery, and zealous devotion to duty, noting that he had infiltrated hostile territory, organized a mixed force of American and German troops, repelled a fanatical SS assault, and held the fortress until reinforcements arrived. Lee would live until 1973, carrying the memory of that surreal battle high in the Austrian Alps. Major Gangl was honored posthumously as an Austrian national hero. In Virgil, a street Sepp Ganglstrasse bears his name, a permanent testament to courage, humanity, and the power of redemption even in the darkest of times. Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the former SS officer who had risked everything to fight alongside Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers to protect the French prisoners at Itta, faced justice after the battle. Arrested by U.S. forces for his previous affiliation with the Nazi Party and the SAS, he was initially sentenced to 2 years in prison. However, recognition of his actions during the battle led to an early release. Schrader lived until 1995, carrying the quiet knowledge that, in the war's final days, he had chosen humanity over ideology, protecting innocents rather than participating in their murder. The Battle of Castle Itta has since been called, with remarkable justification, the strangest battle of World War II. It occurred 5 days after Hitler's suicide and just 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945, effective May 8th at 23:01 CET. It remains the only recorded engagement in the war in which American and German soldiers fought side by side as allies against other German forces. The defenders included American tank crews, African American infantry, Wehrmacht soldiers, a former SS officer, Austrian resistance fighters, and 14 French prisoners whose political views ranged from right-wing leadership to labor union activism, all united to oppose fanatical SS troops. Edouard Daladier, liberated from the fortress, returned to French politics and was elected to the Chamber of Deputies in 1946, serving until 1958. He helped provide stability and institutional experience in reconstructing France's democratic structures after years under Vichy collaboration and German occupation. Daladier also served as mayor of Avignon from 1953 to 1958. He died in Paris on October 10, 1970, at 86, witnessing France's rebirth as a prosperous democracy and a founding member of the European Economic Community. Paul Reynaud similarly returned to political life, elected to the Chamber of Deputies in 1946 and appointed to multiple cabinet positions under the Fourth Republic. He championed European integration and Franco-German reconciliation, never forgetting that a German major had died to save his life, and he publicly honored Major Gango's courage on numerous occasions. Reynaud died on September 21, 1966, at 87. Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, despite their long-standing personal and professional animosity and their controversial roles during France's defeat in 1940, contributed to post-war France in differing ways. Gamelin documented the fall of France and reflected on the lessons of military failure, while Weygand, after legal scrutiny for his collaboration with Vichy France, was eventually cleared and lived quietly until his death. Both provided institutional memory and military expertise crucial to rebuilding the French armed forces. Jean Barotra, the tennis champion whose courage in running through SS fire to reach American reinforcements had helped save the fortress, returned to sports and tennis administration. He continued competing into his 70s and became a beloved figure in French athletics, always recounting the story of the strangest battle of World War II and its unlikely heroes. Barotra died on July 17, 1994, at 95. Léon Jouot, the trade union leader, whose presence alongside right-wing figures like François de la Roque had created constant tension within the castle, resumed his labor activism after the war. For his work promoting international labor rights and cooperation, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1951. Jouot died in 1954, leaving a lasting impact on post-war French labor relations. François de la Roque despite his right-wing politics and leadership of the Croix de Feu in the 1930s, had been imprisoned under Vichy for his resistance activities. After liberation, he returned to France but largely withdrew from public life, dying in 1946. The defenders and survivors of Castle Iter, each from vastly different worlds, went on to live lives shaped indelibly by those 9 extraordinary hours, proving that courage, conscience, and cooperation can transcend ideology, age, and nationality, even in the darkest moments of war. Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, the elder sister of General Charles de Gaulle, returned to France after the war, quietly supporting her brother as he navigated the turbulent path from head of the provisional government to president of the Fifth Republic. She lived a long and fulfilled life, passing away in 1982, proud both of her brother's achievements and of her own contributions to the French resistance. The 14 French prisoners who survived the Battle of Castle Iter went on to play pivotal roles in shaping post-war France. Their wartime experiences, including the surreal and improbable rescue by American and German soldiers fighting side by side, profoundly influenced their approach to European cooperation, Franco-German reconciliation, and the creation of international institutions designed to prevent future conflicts. The establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and its successor, the European Economic Community in 1957, bore the unmistakable imprint of leaders who had witnessed the dangers of nationalism, collaboration, and blind enmity, and who had learned that former enemies could become allies when united by shared values. Despite the battle's extraordinary nature, its story remained relatively unknown to the public for decades. Those who had lived it, John Lee, the American tank commander, the German soldiers who risked their lives to protect the prisoners, and the French survivors, rarely sought recognition. Lee returned to civilian life in the United States and seldom spoke of the events at Iter. The German veterans, wary of scrutiny for their service in the Wehrmacht, preferred anonymity. The French prisoners, focused on rebuilding a nation torn apart by occupation, placed duty over personal glory. It was not until 2013 that the battle's full story reached a wide audience, when military historian Stephen Harding published The Last Battle. Harding's meticulous research, drawing on American military records, German archives, French personal accounts, and Austrian local histories, reconstructed the engagement in vivid detail, revealing one of World War II's most astonishing yet overlooked episodes. The book's success rekindled interest in the event, inspiring the Swedish power metal band Sabaton to release a song titled The Last Battle on their 2016 album The Last Stand, introducing the tale to a new generation. Documentary filmmakers, historians, and studios recognized the universal appeal of the story, courage, redemption, and the capacity of former enemies to unite in defense of shared humanity. Castle Iter itself returned to private ownership after the war and remains privately held today. It is not open to the public, nor is there a formal monument commemorating the battle. Yet the fortress stands as a silent witness, a stone testament to a day when the impossible became reality and enemies became brothers in arms. Military academies and war colleges around the world study the engagement as an extraordinary case of rapid decision-making, effective combined arms tactics with minimal forces, and the defensive potential of fortified positions even against superior numbers. But the lessons of Iter go far beyond strategy. The battle showed that individuals could reject evil ideologies, at great personal risk. That redemption was possible even for those who had served criminal regimes, and that shared humanity could overcome deep-seated national animosity when people looked beyond uniforms and flags. Major Joseph Gangl, who turned against the Nazi regime he had served since 1928 and died protecting French prisoners from execution, became a symbol of moral courage in post-war Austria. In a nation struggling to redefine itself after the Anschluss and years of Nazi collaboration, Gangl and the Austrian resistance fighters of Virgil offered a powerful example of conscience and heroism. The Sepp Ganglstrasse in Virgil commemorates not only one man, but the enduring truth that even in chaos and despair, the imperative to do what is right can shine brighter than any ideology. The African-American soldiers who fought at Castle Itter returned to an America still divided by segregation, where their bravery and service earned only limited recognition in many communities. Yet their actions, alongside those of Americans, Germans, and French, underscored a profound truth. Courage, honor, and humanity can transcend color, nationality, and past enmities, leaving a legacy that endures far beyond the battlefield. The 6 men from Company D, 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, who rode atop Sherman tanks into battle, embody both heroism and the cruel contradictions of post-war America. These African-American soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder with white Americans and German Wehrmacht troops to protect French prisoners. Yet upon returning home, they faced segregation, discrimination, and the painful reality of second-class citizenship. Their names survive in military records, but the details of their post-war lives largely remain obscured, hidden behind the systemic racism that denied them recognition. They were part of the thousands of African-American servicemen who, despite prejudice at home, displayed unwavering courage abroad. Courage that would lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement and the transformation of America in the decades to come. For the German Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought alongside Americans, the aftermath was equally uncertain. Some were briefly held as prisoners of war before being released, while others quietly reintegrated into Austrian or German society, carrying the secret knowledge that in the war's final days they had chosen to act according to conscience rather than national allegiance. Most never spoke of their experiences, wary of retribution from former SS comrades or prosecution for their Wehrmacht service. The motivations behind soldiers like Major Joseph Gangl, his men, and even SS officer Kurt Siegfried Schrader, who chose to defy Nazi orders in the final days of the war, require careful consideration. The cynical explanation that they merely wanted to be on the winning side fails to capture the depth of their actions. Had survival been their only goal, they could have simply deserted, hidden, or waited for Allied forces to arrive, as countless German soldiers did. Instead, Gangl and his men actively sought out the Americans, proposed and participated in a rescue mission that put them in immediate danger, and engaged SS troops who would have executed them as traitors if captured. Their courage went far beyond self-preservation. Many Wehrmacht soldiers had become gradually disillusioned as the true nature of the Nazi regime became impossible to ignore. The systematic slaughter of civilians, reckless military strategies that sacrificed lives for no strategic gain, and the SS's brutal treatment of Germans and Austrians who dared show signs of defeatism. For soldiers like Gangl, a breaking point arrived when orders demanded the execution of military-age males in towns displaying white flags, effectively murdering their own countrymen. in the name of ideology. Choosing to fight for one's nation was one thing. Being ordered to murder one's own people for desiring peace crossed a moral line. Gengel's subsequent alignment with the Austrian resistance, his protection of civilians in Virgil, and his willingness to defend the French prisoners reflect this deeply held principle. The rescue at Itter was an extension of his protective instinct, a tangible opportunity to save innocents from fanaticism. Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader's journey was different, but equally profound. An SS officer, bound by an oath of personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler and the rigid code of the SS, turning against the organization that had defined his adult life, required a profound moral rupture. By choosing to defend the French prisoners, moving his family into the fortress for their protection, and facing certain death if Bochmann's forces prevailed, Schrader demonstrated that even members of fanatical organizations are capable of moral awakening. The French prisoners themselves displayed extraordinary courage, refusing to remain hidden despite Lee's orders. These were elderly civilians, politicians, and generals in their 60s and 70s, a tennis champion in his mid-40s with no obligation to fight. Yet they insisted on taking positions alongside professional soldiers. Gamelin and Weygand, both veterans of France's disastrous early campaigns, wielded rifles with the competence of younger men. Jean Borotra volunteered for the suicidal mission to run through enemy lines and summon reinforcements. Michel Clemenceau, at 71, took up arms and fought on the walls. Their bravery stemmed partly from past military and athletic conditioning, but more fundamentally from an acute understanding of collective survival. If the SS broke through, none would live. Their choice was stark fight or die, and they chose to fight. What makes their unity even more remarkable is the diversity among them. Daladier and Reynaud were bitter political rivals, barely speaking to one another after months in captivity. Weygand had collaborated with Vichy France, drawing contempt from resistance-minded prisoners. François de la Roque represented a right-wing movement opposed to figures like labor leader Léon Jouhaux. Yet, within the crucible of combat, these differences dissolved. Survival, duty, and a shared sense of humanity became the only allegiances that mattered, forging an improbable cohesion that turned a disparate group of politicians, generals, athletes, and soldiers into a single, determined fighting force. They fought not just as Frenchmen, nor merely as prisoners bound by circumstance, but as human beings whose very survival demanded unity. Imagine it. Men divided by politics and past grudges, suddenly standing shoulder to shoulder, weapons in hand, bound by the simple will to live. Yet this fragile brotherhood, born in crisis, did not endure beyond the war's end. When peace returned, so did the old divisions. Still, for one brief, extraordinary day, they proved that even the deepest ideological rifts can be bridged when humanity itself is on the line. The Battle of Castle Itter remains one of World War II's most remarkable confrontations, not because it changed the course of the war, but because of what it revealed about the human spirit. In those final chaotic hours, when hatred should have reigned supreme, Americans and Germans chose to fight together. A Wehrmacht major and an SS captain defied their oaths, risking everything, some paying with their lives, to shield their supposed enemies. French politicians laid aside years of rivalry. African-American soldiers, aware they would return to a segregated homeland, nonetheless fought with unwavering valor. The Austrian resistance joined hands with former occupiers, and a Croatian communist, a Czech cook, and a French tennis champion each played their part in averting a massacre. Out of desperation was forged a fleeting alliance, yet it was held together by something far stronger: shared values, shared humanity. Even in history's darkest night, compassion and cooperation refused to die. The meaning of this battle stretches far beyond the pages of military history. In an age increasingly defined by polarization, nationalism, and the vilification of opponents, Castle Itta stands as a beacon, a reminder that enemies can become allies, that common principles can transcend borders, and that moral courage can bloom even in poisoned soil. Major Joseph Gangel's decision to turn against the Nazi regime did not erase his years in uniform. It did not recast him as a lifelong resistor. It was simply one man, in one fateful moment, choosing to do what conscience demanded, regardless of the cost. That choice took his life, but it also redeemed it. His sacrifice showed that it is never too late to reject evil, to stand for what is right. Inside the fortress, the French prisoners, men of wildly different political persuasions, many of whom despised one another, found themselves forced into cooperation. They did not reconcile their ideologies, nor did they suddenly become friends. Yet on May 5, 1945, with SS troops approaching and death at their door, they recognized that their shared humanity outweighed their bitter disputes. What mattered was not who was right in Parliament, but who stood together against annihilation. First Lieutenant John Lee embodied another kind of courage, the moral kind. Imagine his choice to risk his own life and the lives of his men to rescue strangers of another nation, men who could offer him nothing in return. He acted not for gain or glory, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And when Lee accepted the help of German soldiers, his recent enemies, he displayed a rare wisdom. He judged not by uniform, but by deed, not by allegiance, but by heart. Major Gangel, a veteran of the Wehrmacht since 1928, came forward offering aid to save French prisoners from execution. Lee did not hesitate. In that instant, two men from opposing sides saw each other not as enemies, but as fellow human beings making a stand against cruelty. Such clarity to see the person behind the symbol is one of the rarest gifts of all. The African-American soldiers who fought at Castle Itta carried yet another layer of moral weight. They served a nation that denied them full equality, yet they fought for the ideals that nation proclaimed: liberty, democracy, justice. Their courage did not just defend Europe, it helped lay the moral groundwork for the civil rights movement that would one day transform America itself. Stephen Harding, whose 2013 book, The Last Battle, brought this story to light, reminded the world that the fight for Castle Itta was never just a military episode. It was a living testament to what humans can achieve when guided by conscience rather than convention, by principle rather than prejudice. Every participant defied expectation. The Americans risked everything for prisoners of another land. The Germans turned their guns on their own comrades. The French fought shoulder to shoulder with their rescuers. In that brief, astonishing moment at Castle Itta, the world glimpsed what humanity could be at its best, united not by nationality or ideology, but by the simple, unbreakable choice to do what is right. The SS officer, too, made his choice to turn away from the fanaticism that had consumed his organization. In that single act of defiance, joined with others who followed conscience over command, a rare moment of grace emerged amid the darkest war in human history. The continuing popularity of Stephen Harding's The Last Battle and the fascination that modern readers and historians show toward this event reveal something profound. We crave stories that move beyond simple tales of heroes and villains. We long for accounts that expose the deep, complicated truth of human nature. Picture it, Americans and Germans, recent enemies, standing side by side against the SS. That vision alone carries an enduring promise that reconciliation is not only imaginable, but attainable, that even the most bitter foes can find common cause, that shared values can rise above the ruins of hatred. High above the valleys of Austria, the fortress still watches silently from its hilltop, its ancient stones overlooking the Alpine peaks. Though privately owned and closed to the public, it remains visible to anyone traveling through the surrounding villages. Locals know its story well. Guides mention it to curious visitors, their voices lowering with respect as they recount how, in the last desperate hours of Europe's bloodiest conflict, Austrians, Americans, Germans, and Frenchmen stood together against evil itself. The fortress has become more than a ruin. It is a symbol woven into the identity of the land, a reminder that courage and conscience once prevailed there. In the nearby town of Vergel, Seppgangelstrasse bears the name of the German major whose sacrifice continues to speak across generations. Every time a resident walks that street, every visitor who glances at the sign is reminded of Joseph Gangel, the soldier who chose to die protecting French prisoners from his own countrymen. The name on that street sign does not erase his earlier years of service under the Nazi flag, but it honors his final act of defiance. It affirms that redemption, though costly, is possible for those willing to risk everything to reject evil. Ultimately, the story of Castle Itter is a story of hope. Hope that people can change, hope that enemies can forgive, hope that courage can overcome cruelty, and that the better angels of our nature can triumph even in the deepest shadows of war. On May 5, 1945, as the guns of the Third Reich fell silent, a small band of unlikely allies proved that these ideals are not dreams, but realities achievable when conviction outweighs fear. Their legacy endures. It challenges us still, reminding us of what humanity can accomplish when we choose to see the person before the uniform, when we act from principle rather than prejudice, and when we dare to do what is right, no matter the cost. The Battle of Castle Itter teaches that redemption is real, that former enemies can stand together, that moral courage can alter the course of events, that shared values surpass national boundaries, and that it is never too late to stand on the side of what is just. Those lessons born on an Austrian hillside 80 years ago remain as vital today as they were in 1945. For it is in the crucible of crisis that our true nature is revealed, and the choices we make then determine not only who we are, but the legacy we leave for those who follow.